I walked into my villa in Northwest Austin earlier than usual that afternoon. The sunset was hitting the marble floors, but the house felt hollow. Then I heard her. My sister, Caitlin, was in the living room on the phone. Her voice was a temperature I'd never heard before, clinical and ice cold. She had no clue I was just a few feet away, absorbing every syllable. She snorted into the receiver and said, "Yeah, I cut the brake lines. See you at her funeral tomorrow. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community." I didn't let a single floorboard creak as I backed away from the living room. My heart wasn't racing from fear. It was vibrating with a new clinical frequency. I matched my steps to the rhythm of Caitlin's laughter in the other room, ensuring my retreat was as silent as the grave she'd planned for me. To her, I was already a ghost, a messy, loose end she had finally handled. I slipped back through the heavy oak door and into the humid Northwest Austin air. I didn't scream, and I didn't call our mother to cry about the betrayal. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I sat in my sedan at the curb, 3 houses down, and pulled out my phone. I didn't dial 911. Instead, I called a specialized heavy-duty tow service I had used for years in my estate planning business. They were discreet, efficient, and they didn't ask questions as long as the payment cleared. I told the dispatcher I needed the black SUV in my driveway moved immediately to my sister's property, on the other side of the hills. I had been the silent investor in Caitlin's version of family for my entire life, but I was done footing the bill for her illusions. Within 20 minutes, the flatbed rumbled up the street. I watched from my rearview mirror as the driver winched the death trap onto the rack. He didn't know the brake lines were hanging like shredded ribbons underneath. He didn't know he was transporting a murder weapon. I walked up to him, my face a mask of professional precision. I handed him the keys and a plain white envelope. Inside, I had used a thick black marker to write the words, "Your inheritance has arrived." "Tell the man who answers that this is a gift from his wife," I told him. The driver gave me a strange look, sensing the weight of the moment, but he nodded and climbed back into his cab. I followed at a distance, watching the truck navigate the winding roads of Northwest Austin. I had managed the $1,600,000 sitting in our father's trust with absolute transparency, yet Caitlin had decided her greed was worth more than my life. I watched the delivery from the corner of the block. I saw Alexander, her husband, open the front door in his casual weekend clothes. I saw the confusion on his face as the flatbed tilted and the SUV, the car meant to be my coffin, was dropped right in his driveway. He took the envelope from the driver, reading my note under the porch light. Even from a distance, I could see his posture stiffen as the words sank in. I checked my watch, 11:58 p.m. I opened my laptop, the screen glowing in the dark interior of my car. I didn't feel the need for closure or a tearful reconciliation. I just felt the cold satisfaction of an account finally being settled. Caitlin thought she was celebrating a funeral tomorrow. She didn't realize that when you try to cut a line, you have to be careful which end you're holding. I sat there in the silence, watching the lights go on in her house, waiting for the first crack in her glass facade to appear. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. The hum of the central air conditioning in the bank was the only sound in the dead of the night. I sat in my private office on the top floor, looking out over the flickering lights of the Austin skyline. On my desk sat the thick, leather-bound folder for our family estate. I ran my fingers over the gold-embossed seal, Jacob and Patricia Blake. They had spent their lives building a safety net of $1,600,000, trusting me to be the gatekeeper of their legacy. I had taken that role with a reverence that Caitlin viewed as an insult, an obstacle to the life she felt she was owed. I scrolled through the digital statements on my monitor, seeing every withdrawal I'd authorized for her $25,000 for a boutique business venture that lasted exactly 3 months, $15,000 for a spiritual retreat in Europe. I'd been the silent investor in her fiction of success, the invisible support beam holding up a house of cards. But as I sat there in the silence of the vault, the weight of the files felt different. I was no longer looking at my sister's requests. I was looking at a predator's paper trail. It was then that I truly understood the trap of cruel normalization I had been living in for years. I had spent my entire adult life treating Caitlin's accidents as personality quirks. When she unintentionally ruined my graduation dress or slipped and broke a piece of my heirloom jewelry, I had just sighed and moved on to keep the peace. This is how the cycle works. You begin to accept small acts of cruelty as your standard environment because they are delivered by someone who shares your DNA. You stop questioning the small thefts because they've become part of the background noise of your family. I had allowed her to test her tools on my smaller joys, effectively training her for the moment she would decide to cut the lines on my life. I remembered the smell of the spilled ink on my favorite designer bag 3 years ago, a gift to myself for landing the senior analyst position. Caitlin had laughed and told me I was too sensitive when I found the black stain ruining the interior. She said it was just a bag, that with all the trust money under my thumb, I could buy a dozen more if I wanted to. I hadn't realized back then that the stain wasn't on the leather, it was on her conscience. My compassion had been a luxury she had overdrafted for decades, and my silence had been her greatest accomplice. I looked at the balance sheet one last time. $1,600,000. To Caitlin, this wasn't a legacy to be protected. It was a bounty to be claimed. She had de-romanticized our sisterhood long ago, turning our relationship into a high-stakes gamble where my death was the only payout she was interested in. Well, the terms of the contract had changed tonight. The interest was finally due. I stood up, closed the folder, and felt the ice of the Austin night enter my veins. There were no more sisters in this room, only a creditor and a debtor who had finally run out of time. The air at the secure impound lot in Northwest Austin was thick with the scent of old grease and cold iron. I walked through the rows of damaged vehicles, my heels clicking on the pavement with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. Jed was already there, his silhouette hunched under the raised SUV. He was the only mechanic our family had trusted for 20 years, a man who saw the truth in metal and oil that we often refused to see in each other. I didn't greet him with a smile, and I didn't offer a polite inquiry about his day. I simply stood by the fender and asked for the verdict. Jed slid out from under the chassis, wiping thick, dark grime from his palms onto a rag that had seen better decades. His face was a map of deep-set concern. He didn't waste time with technical jargon or gentle transitions. He told me the brake lines had not snapped from wear, heat, or faulty manufacturing. They had been sliced almost clean through with a sharp tool, specifically designed to fail under hard pressure. It was a surgical strike. Whoever had done this wasn't just hoping for an accident. They were calculating a fatality. But then, Jed reached into the pocket of his overalls and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a microfiber cloth. He handed it to me without a word. As the fabric fell away, the harsh fluorescent lights of the garage glinted off the polished surface of a gold-plated wrench. My breath caught, though I kept my expression as flat as a professional balance sheet. It was a family heirloom, a ceremonial tool gifted to our father, Jacob, decades ago. It usually sat in a velvet-lined display case in the library of our villa, a symbol of the hard work and legacy that had built our $1,600,000 trust fund. The betrayal was now physical, heavy, and ancestral. Caitlin hadn't just sabotaged my car. She had desecrated our father's memory to do it. She had used the very tool that symbolized our family's rise to facilitate my permanent exit. She had reached into our history to murder our future. I held the wrench, feeling its weight 18 ounces of gold and steel that had been transformed from a trophy into a weapon. She had been so blinded by her $600,000 secret debt that she had left the most damning piece of evidence wedged near the chassis. I realized then that our family history was not a story of shared values. It was a series of one-sided transactions I had consistently overvalued. The wrench was no longer a legacy. It was a piece of forensic evidence. I dropped it into a heavy-duty plastic bag and felt the final thread of my sisterly sentimentality snap. Caitlin had used a golden tool to do a dirty job, and now I had the one thing she feared most undeniable: physical proof. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was a criminal file, and I was the only one with the authority to close it. I didn't have to wait long for the glass facade to shatter. My phone vibrated with a relentless, rhythmic intensity, the digital heartbeat of a cornered predator. Caitlin hadn't called to apologize. She had gone to war on the only battlefield she understood: social media. I watched as the first post went live on her feed, featuring a grainy photo of the SUV being dropped in her driveway. Her caption was a masterpiece of gaslighting, painting me as a mentally unstable sibling who was harassing a family in mourning. She even tagged our mother, Patricia, who immediately began blowing up my phone with tearful texts about family unity and how I was creating a public mess out of a simple misunderstanding. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that I'd finally stopped playing along. I didn't answer a single message. Instead, I went back to my laptop and pulled up the deeper audit I'd commissioned with my legal team. While Caitlin was busy curating an image of the victim, I was uncovering the architecture of her true crime. It wasn't just about the $1,600,000 trust anymore. I discovered that Caitlin had quietly taken out a secondary life insurance policy on me, a $500,000 payout that named her as the sole beneficiary. But the lethal stroke was the forged signature. She hadn't just sabotaged the vehicle, she had attempted to frame her own husband, Alexander. In the car's digital maintenance logs, she had uploaded forged entries with his electronic signature, making it appear that he was the last one to inspect the undercarriage. She was planning to claim a double payout: my life insurance and a wrongful death suit against the architect she called her partner. I sat back, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. This was the pure manifestation of the illusion of power from an empty wallet. Caitlin had spent years perfecting the art of having without being. She had the designer clothes, the Northwest Austin address, and the socialite status. But beneath that expensive veneer, her wallet was a vacuum. When you have no internal value, your entire existence becomes a performance that requires constant, desperate funding. People like Caitlin don't see human beings as family. They see them as assets to be liquidated to maintain their hollow facade. To her, I wasn't a sister. I was a $600,000 debt solution. She was willing to burn the entire world down just to keep the lights on in a house she couldn't afford. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret for what I was about to do, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a criminal prosecution waiting to happen. Every text she sent, every public lie she posted was just another line item on the invoice I was about to hand her. I closed the lid of my laptop. Inside, the screen glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I was no longer just the gatekeeper of a legacy. I was the one delivering the final statement. I sent the text at 5 p.m. One message to the group chat: family meeting, Northwest Austin Villa, 6:30 p.m. Final decision on the $1,600,000 trust. I didn't need to add anything else. Greed is a better motivator than any invitation. I stood in the library, the same room where the gold-plated wrench used to sit, watching the golden hour light stretch across the floorboards like a long, accusing finger. Caitlin arrived at 6:31 p.m. She didn't knock. She walked in with a confidence she hadn't earned, her heels echoing a sharp staccato against the marble. Our mother, Patricia, followed behind her, already dabbing her eyes in a practiced display of maternal grief. Alexander was the last to enter. He looked like he hadn't slept since the SUV arrived in his driveway. His architect's eye was finally seeing the structural flaws in his own marriage. Caitlin didn't sit down. She leaned over the mahogany desk, her eyes bright with the fever of a $600,000 debt she thought was about to disappear. "About time you saw reason, Elizabeth," she snapped. "Mom's exhausted. Alexander is a mess. All because you wanted to play God with Dad's money. Just sign the release forms, and we can end this nightmare." My mother nodded, murmuring something about family being more important than pride. I didn't reach for a pen. I didn't even look at the release forms she'd brought. I looked at the digital speaker sitting in the center of the desk. "I didn't call you here to negotiate a contract," I said. My voice was a flat line. "I called you here to review the final audit." I saw a flicker of hesitation in Caitlin's eyes, but she masked it with a sneer. An audit? For what? We know the numbers. Not those numbers, I replied. I tapped the screen of my phone. The room went so silent I could hear the hum of the pool pump outside. Then, the recording started. It was Caitlin's voice, amplified and crystal clear. Yeah, I cut the brake lines. See you at her funeral tomorrow. The snort that followed sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I watched Caitlin's face. It was the most satisfying transaction of my life. The color didn't just drain, it vanished, leaving behind a gray, ash-like mask of terror. She tried to speak, but her vocal cords had seemingly been cut as clean as those brake lines. Beside her, Alexander backed away. He looked at her like she was a stranger he'd accidentally married. Caitlin? He whispered, the single word heavy, with the weight of a dying trust. My mother started to shriek, a high, panicked sound, but I ignored her. I pressed a second button on my desk. The heavy library doors opened, and the two detectives who had been listening from the dining room stepped inside. No more acting, no more victim play. I stood up and straightened my blazer. They weren't shocked by what they'd done, I said to the room. They were shocked that I'd stopped playing along. This was the power flip. The predator was now the prey. As they handcuffed my sister, she didn't look like a socialite. She looked like a debt that had finally been called in. The legal system is often described as an engine of justice, but to me, it was simply an engine of facts. The trial was short and sharp, a mirror of the evidence I had meticulously gathered. I sat in the front row of the courtroom, my posture as straight as the lines on my balance sheets, while the judge read the verdict. Caitlin was sentenced to 12 years for attempted reckless endangerment with premeditation. She didn't look like a socialite anymore. She looked like a calculated risk that had finally reached its expiration date. My mother, Patricia, tried to catch my eye, her face wet with a maternal grief I no longer felt obligated to subsidize. But I looked right through her. The subscription to their version of family had been canceled, and I was no longer footing the bill. That evening, I stood on the balcony of the Northwest Austin villa, watching the city lights flicker to life. The hum of the hills was peaceful for the first time in my life. In front of me sat the final documents for the $1,600,000 trust. With a single, steady signature, I redefined our family's legacy. I didn't spend the money on a bigger house or a louder life. Instead, I officially established the Survivors Safety Foundation. This was the moment I realized the true nature of Seed Sower's justice. Most people think justice is about the weight of the hammer, or the length of the sentence, the justice of punishment. But there is a higher level, the justice of the builder. Punishment looks at the past, obsessing over the wounds and the debt. But a seed sower looks at the future. I realized that the best way to handle the lines Caitlin tried to break was to use the resources she coveted to weave a safety net for others. I wasn't just erasing her. I was creating something she could never understand. The inheritance that was meant to be my end became the beginning for hundreds of others who needed a gatekeeper to protect them from the predators in their own bloodlines. I made two final executive decisions. I sent the SUV to be crushed into a cube of scrap metal, a symbolic disposal of the trap she'd set for me. Then, I took the gold-plated wrench, the family heirloom she'd used as a weapon, and donated it to a museum of local history. It belongs to the past, now a relic of a legacy built on hard work that was almost destroyed by entitlement. I walked back inside the villa and closed the glass doors. The silence wasn't heavy, it was clean. I went to bed and slept through until morning for the first time in years. No guilt, no noise, and no more checking my rearview mirror. Inside me, the sunrise was no longer a deadline for survival. It was a testament to the power of facts, boundaries, and the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed. If this story reminded you that boundaries are your greatest strength, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to know it's okay to choose your safety over your DNA. Let's keep the conversation going down in the comments.